On October the 17th, 1888, before sunrise had cleared the cottonwood bluffs east of Coldwater, the temperature stood at 21 degrees, and frost lay in a white skin over the wagon ruts that passed for the town's 2 streets. Coldwater held 286 souls by the church ledger, one church with a bell rope worn shiny by funerals and fire calls, one general store with a false front and broad porch, and 6 homesteads thrown so far into the surrounding draws that after dark they were beyond rifle call and beyond ordinary mercy. From his first circuit of the place, Shane judged that distance could kill on the frontier as surely as weather or hunger, even if most people spoke of it as an inconvenience rather than an enemy. Smoke lifted from stovepipes in steady columns that morning, thin and gray in a windless sky, and the settlement looked settled in the way new places often did. Planks still bright, confidence still untested, danger discussed as if it belonged to another map. By noon, a solitary wagon rolled in from the south track, axle crying at each turn, loaded not with furniture but with tools sorted in military order, and one cedar chest bound by iron straps. The driver was Shane Ford, 38 years old, a widower for 11 months, with shoulders shaped by labor rather than display, and hands marked by cut lines that had long ago become pale ridges. His coat had been brushed but not tailored. His boots were repaired at the heel with square nails, and he spoke little while the livery boy watered his horse. He paid cash for 2 nights in the boarding room behind the store, then spent the evening walking both streets, counting steps between corner lots, checking the lay of draws, and asking which home sat furthest out after the sun went down. Folk noticed that he watched ridge lines more than faces. Miriam Ford had been buried in Laramie County the previous November, and Shane still carried what old neighbors there had told him after the service. She had kept notebooks as carefully as others kept family Bibles. He had heard the same from her kin, who said her mother's line had come from Scottish Highland sheep stations, where winter wind erased paths and raiders tested isolated holdings first, and where warning had long been treated not as fear, but as household craft. In that tradition, messages traveled through mirror flashes by day, drawn wire by night, and watch calls passed at strict intervals from hill to hill. Miriam had learned those methods from her grandfather, then adapted them to Wyoming distances. Shane had learned them from Miriam through years of shared work, corrections made by lantern light, and one bitter spring when delayed warning cost a neighboring camp its herd. After her death, he carried her cedar chest westward because he considered it equipment, not relic. The chest held 6 ruled notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, a pouch of brass ferrules, 2 hand augers, 1 folding transit level, a coil gauge for wire diameter, and a ledger where Miriam had copied older instructions in a neat slanting hand. Between recipes for pitch sealant and notes on bell resonance, she had written one sentence twice, once in ink and once in pencil. Warning that arrives late is not warning. Shane never recited that line in public, yet it governed his calculations as plainly as a survey stake governs a fence. He studied Coldwater's layout against Miriam's pages and saw at once that the town was built in a confidence gap. Men had set their homes where water and grazing suited them, then assumed that shouted alarm could cross ground, which swallowed sound and time. It could not. On the 19th of October, he purchased a stony quarter-acre in a shallow draw north of Bellamy Ridge for $3 an acre, land dismissed by speculators as too poor for crops and too awkward for a show house. That same afternoon, Horace Kincaid, owner of the general store and holder of more notes than any other creditor in Coldwater, laughed from his porch and asked within hearing of teamsters why a man would pay good money to live in a ditch. Kincaid was a prosperous figure, broad through the middle from comfort, clean-shaven each morning, dressed in dark broadcloth with polished boots that reflected porch rails like black glass. He had built his standing on supply timing and credit discipline, and because he extended both, he believed he understood risk better than any newcomer. Shane answered with price questions instead of pride. Cedar post cost by length, telegraph salvage by pound, nails by keg, pitch by tin. Kincaid gave numbers and a smirk, then watched him walk away with a notebook open. 3 days later, Shane laid out his first baseline from his cellar site toward the Morrow homestead, pacing and repacing until his count matched the transit reading within half a yard. He marked intervals at 60 yards with willow stakes, then returned with cedar posts trimmed to 7 feet, charring the buried ends over a trench fire to resist rot before setting them 3 feet deep with anchor stones packed hard around each foot. The work was precise and slow. Auger, tamp, level, sightline, adjust, tamp again. He set each post with a forward lean of 1 inch against expected pull, following a diagram from Miriam's second notebook that accounted for wire contraction in hard freeze. By the close of October 24th, 4 posts stood on the first run, and his hands were raw where the gloves had split. He did not build an ordinary fence. He was creating a signal lattice with one purpose: to carry alarm from the 6 farthest homes to a central station in less than half a minute. At his draw lot, he cut into the slope and timbered a half cellar 10 feet by 14 feet, roofed with split poles, packed earth, and 2 inches of clay, where sound would concentrate and weather would not. Along the rafters, he planned 6 tin resonance cans, each tuned by size and cord tension to a distinct note, so that one pull could tell him not only that danger had appeared, but where. Materials moved in ledgers as carefully as in wagons. Cedar posts and stone wedges came to $9.40. Salvaged telegraph wire from dismantled lines south of Casper was priced at 6 cents a pound when bought in mixed lengths. Iron staples, ferrules, and pitch ran another $3, 12 cents in the first week. He tracked every cent beside every yard, because frontier systems failed as often from poor accounts as poor carpentry. By the final week of October, the town had supplied itself a name for his labor, at least everywhere Shane walked within earshot. It began with Kincaid, spoken as he chalked prices on a board outside the store. Ford's Madness Line. The phrase met Shane in doorways, at the pump, and after Sunday service when men lingered to talk on the steps. Children took to trailing him at a distance, tapping spoons on tin pails and making mock bell sounds whenever he checked tension on a test wire. Men on porch rails asked whether he planned to catch weather in those strings. One ranch hand called out that raiders would kindly wait while he consulted his music cans. Shane did not answer any of them with argument. He measured, spliced, and moved to the next post. When an older widow from the western edge asked quietly why he endured it, he told her only this: let them talk. Words do not travel as fast as danger. The first complete span he finished linked his cellar station to 2 of the outlying homes and held tension through 1 cold night and 1 noon thaw, without sagging more than half an inch. That test gave him confidence to continue toward the remaining 4 houses before the first hard freeze locked the ground like iron. On November 1st, under a high gray sky and a crosswind out of the northwest, he hauled another wire bundle to the draw, weighed it on a borrowed scale, and entered the figure in Miriam's ledger beneath the prior line of totals. The sum looked severe for one man, yet still possible. His aim was to finish the private 6-house network by mid-month, then petition the church council for permission to connect church bell and school roof as common alarm points if the town proved willing. Coldwater remained unconvinced, but the posts remained upright. The wire held true, and the work advanced yard by yard into ground that had already begun to ring with frost. By late afternoon on November 2nd, while Shane was still coiling the fresh bundle at his cellar door, a freight team came limping in from the South Pass Road with one wagon side charred black, one rear wheel wrapped in rawhide where iron had split, and two mules showing fresh bandage at the shoulder. The teamster, Eli Griever, did not unhitch before he shouted for water. He reported 3 ranch camps struck in 9 nights, all of them after midnight, all of them at the outer margins where nearest help stood miles away. In his account, the riders did not linger for pitched battle. They fired into lighted windows, put flame to hay and tack sheds, and took whatever horseflesh could be run in darkness. At sunset that day, the wind turned sharper out of the northwest, carrying smoke from the freight wagon's burned planks across the church lot. By supper time, the town held an unease that no one named directly, because naming a danger on the frontier gave it shape, and shaped danger demanded action. Shane listened without interruption, then asked Griever 3 questions that sounded almost cold to bystanders. How many minutes passed between first shot and first bell in the nearest settlement? How far the farthest cabin stood from that bell? And whether dogs gave warning in advance? Griever answered as best he could. 20 minutes in one camp, perhaps 12 in another. No bell at all in the third, because rope had been cut. Dogs had barked in 2 places, but people had cursed them quiet. Shane thanked him, stepped into his cellar and opened Miriam's 4th notebook to the pages where she had copied Highland timing drills for dispersed holdings under mounted threat. Her pencil marks from years earlier remained clear in the margin. Distance lies. Time tells the truth. At the church council that evening, lamps trimmed low to save oil and faces drawn into hard lines by fatigue, Shane laid a folded map on the pine table and held it flat with a wrench at each corner. He had drawn each outlying household, each line run completed, and each gap that still relied on shouted warning. He spoke in measured terms, never raising his voice, giving figures as if reading inventory. From Morrow Place to Church Bell by horse in darkness, 13 to 16 minutes in fairground, longer if wash crossing was slick. From Bellamy Ridge to School Roof by runner, 9 minutes for a strong youth, longer for anyone carrying a child. His proposal was not broad. He asked permission to tie 1 branch to the church bell frame and 1 to a roof pulley at the school, both with agreed pull codes posted publicly so any household could recognize alarm source and direction. Horace Kincaid sat near the stove with 1 ankle crossed over the other. Broadcloth coat brushed free of dust, silver watch chain bright in lamplight. He let Shane finish, then leaned forward and smiled as a man smiles when confident he speaks for the room. He said panic spent faster than powder and cost more, and that Coldwater was not a sheep station clinging to sea cliffs. He said men who talked to fence posts and tins should not instruct settled folk in public safety. 2 councilmen looked down. One cleared his throat, then asked whether the church could risk its bell rope to private contrivances. The request was declined without vote, deferred to a later date that everyone understood as no. When meeting ended, Kincaid called after him from the porch, loud enough for the teamsters at the hitch rail. Credit would not be extended for more wire, he said, not for foolishness that encouraged fear. Shane did not answer. He walked to his drawer under a rising moon, took from the cedar chest the silver hair comb Miriam had worn on their wedding day, wrapped it in cloth, and before sunrise sold it to a jeweler passing with the freight party for $4 cash. By noon, he had purchased scrap telegraph wire by weight from a rail maintenance crew camped 12 miles south, mixed gauges and rusted lengths, 281 pounds at 5 cents a pound, plus $1.20 for transport to the creek crossing. The teamster, who should have hauled cedar posts to his lot, declined that same day after a private talk at Kincaid's porch rail. Shane cut his load in half and dragged it by hand sled over frozen ground, then returned for the second half after dark. Through the first week of November, he worked from gray dawn until lamplight blurred his sightline. He buried anchor stones at each turning point, stones that weighed no less than 40 pounds each where he could find them, and no less than 25 where he could not, and packed each pit with tamped gravel before setting the post. He cleaned salvage wire with sand and tallow cloth, then spliced joints using brass ferrules heated in a charcoal pan and sealed with pitch so moisture would not wick into the twists. Inside the cellar, he hung 6 resonance cans from separate rafters, each one cut to different depth and throat, then tuned each by cord length until every pull produced a distinct note. The north run gave a low iron hum, the Bellamy branch a higher ring with narrow decay, the Morrow branch a flat tone that carried longest in wind. He recorded every adjustment in ledger columns, so another hand could maintain it if he were absent. By November 7th, the full run stood at 1,940 yards of active line, with 2 unfinished junctions, and his materials totaled $27.08, including replacement staples bent during one failed pull test. Coldwater answered labor with ridicule because ridicule required no labor of its own. Kincaid hung a chalkboard outside the store reading "Madness sold here by the spool," and when customers laughed, he bowed as if he had made a rare purchase for their amusement. Boys tapped metal cups against posts when Shane passed. 2 ranch hands took to counting out loud when he measured tension, stopping at random to say, "That is where fear reaches a man." Yet mockery had begun to fracture at its edges. Dogs bayed toward empty ridges at noon on 2 separate days, neither day followed by wagon traffic. Fresh horse sign appeared twice near creek crossings, where no local herd had reason to pass. One track showing a shoenail pattern not sold in Coldwater. On November 11th, a warm wind settled over town by mid-morning, too soft for the season and too still in its middle, and chickens moved beneath sheds rather than in open yards. Shane called it to the Bellamys as he checked their line bracket, the quiet before men with matches. Ruth Bellamy heard him and did not laugh. She was 14, narrow-shouldered, quick-footed, and already trusted by 3 households to carry medicine notes when roads were rough. She asked if a person could learn the pull codes by ear. Shane brought her into the cellar with her mother's permission, struck each line in sequence, and had her repeat source and meaning until she spoke them without pause. One long, one short from North Branch. Riders sighted but distant. 2 short, one long from Ridge Branch. Close movement and lamps out. 3 rapid pulls from Central Clacker. Muster at Stone Cover within 7 minutes. Ruth carried these slips in folded paper to the 6 linked homes, and then, finding 2 families unwilling to read them, demonstrated in the schoolyard with a pocket watch and a clothesline tied to fence posts. She timed children running from door to ditch while mothers counted breaths. Practical proof moved where argument had stalled. By the 2nd week of November, the tone of town talk had changed from amusement to strained performance. Men still mocked in public, but several asked Shane private questions by the pump. How much lamp oil to keep in cellar? Where to stack water pails so they would not freeze solid? Whether wagons should be hitched overnight or left untraced. He answered all of them without naming their prior words. Kincaid remained outwardly contemptuous. He added fresh chalk to his board after rain blurred the letters, and he told a customer that fear merchants profited from rumor. Yet, on the evening of November the 12th, he ordered his clerk, Owen Lark, to bed down in the store loft with a rifle and 2 extra bandoliers. The order traveled through town before dawn, because instructions in small settlements never remained private for long. On November 14th, with sky low and colorless and temperature at 18 degrees by sunrise, Shane found his western segment down near Kincaid pasture, where line crossed a shallow wash. The wire had not snapped from cold contraction. It had been cut clean with nippers, both ends tucked beneath dead grass, as if the hand had hoped delay rather than discovery. He stood with the 2 severed pieces in his gloves, then measured his response in numbers instead of anger. A single line could be broken. A network could absorb loss. He worked through that day and into the night under a hooded lantern, rebuilding the damaged segment and changing the design in one push. He added a second redundant loop through the dry creek bed, hidden low against stone where a rider would not see it from saddle height. Then installed 2 trip pins at blind approaches that would release weighted strikers against tin plates if disturbed. In the cellar, he mounted a hand-crank clacker on a bolted oak plank, teeth cut from an old harrow wheel and spring tension set by trial, until pulses carried evenly across all branches. If one branch failed, the central crank could still broadcast to all 6 homes by agreed code. Ruth watched part of the repair at dusk, then repeated the new drill the next morning in the schoolyard, with her watch held high. This time joined by children from houses that had mocked the first practice. By evening on November 15th, 6 households could identify alarm direction by note, confirm by pulse pattern, and reach designated stone cover in under 7 minutes during 2 full runs. Shane entered those times into Miriam's ledger, not as pride, but as baseline. Kincaid passed the draw on horseback at sunset, slowed when he saw the extra loop staked along the creek line, and said to no one in particular that a town could not live forever with wires stretched like snares. Shane tightened one ferrule, checked the clacker spring, and replied that a town could not live long without warning shared by every household. Kincaid rode on without answer, and in the store loft that night, Owen Lark slept in his boots beside a loaded rifle, while the chalkboard still faced the street. Shane carried a crate of sorted wire ends into the cellar and set it beside Miriam's ledger, then turned the lantern wick low and began the night's work of making unequal material behave as one system. Salvage lengths from rail crews varied by gauge and temper, and if they were tied carelessly, they sang in different strains, confusing the ear at the very moment when clarity mattered more than speed. He cut each piece to measured span, filed burrs from old cuts, seated brass ferrules with a hand press, and sealed every joint with warm pitch, brushed thin so it would flex in cold rather than crack. On a pine board fixed to the east wall, he marked each branch by distance and bearing from cellar door: Morrow north by east, Bellamy Ridge west, Hale draw south quarter west, and 3 more in steady script. Beside each entry he wrote tested travel times in minutes for a mounted messenger and for a runner through dark ground. By lantern midnight his fingers were black with pitch and metal dust. The lines held tone through 4 pull trials and 1 clacker sequence. He noted each result with date, hour, and exterior temperature, 14 degrees at final test. Before dawn on November 16th, he moved from mechanical reliability to human reliability, because he knew the second failed more often than the first. At each linked house he replaced spoken instructions with nailed code slats, cut from cratewood, each slat painted in lamp black and flour paste, so letters could be read by dim light. 1 long, 1 short. Outer movement observed. 2 short, 1 long, close approach. Extinguish lamps. 3. Rapid from cellar. Muster at stone cover. He drove the nails himself and stood until the household repeated back the code without error. At the Morrow place he adjusted their cellar hatch so it cleared a warped threshold in 1 pull. At the Hale place he reset a hinge pin on the stock shed where children had stumbled during drill. At the Bellamy place he measured the ditch route to stone cover at 146 yards, then had Ruth and her mother walk it with blankets folded over their arms to simulate burden. 7 minutes remained his standard, not because it was elegant, but because it could be met by tired adults carrying sleeping young. He trimmed each procedure to that number. Materials continued to decide what could be built and what must be improvised. He could not afford iron pulleys for every turn, So he cut roller guides from seasoned cottonwood blocks and lined grooves with scrap leather soaked in tallow to reduce wear. He broke bottlenecks from green glass medicine jars, heated them until edges softened, and set them as crude insulators where wire brushed against post hardware. Not for electrical purpose, but to keep moisture from freezing joints solid around the staples. From a broken wagon spring, he forged 3 replacement striker arms for the tin plates in the blind approaches, quenching each in a bucket that skinned over with ice between dips. Every cost went to ledger margin. Lamp oil 18 cents for 2 nights, nails 42 cents, leather scrap traded for 1 rabbit pelt, extra flour paste, no charge from Bellamy Kitchen. By supper on the 16th, he had added 12 secondary tie points and 1 interior crossline from cellar to his horse rail, so he could trigger pulses while mounting. The network had grown from a contrivance into infrastructure, though no council had voted it so. Coldwater answered growth with sharper forms of dismissal, because ridicule felt safer than admitting dependence on a man they had refused. Kincaid moved beyond porch remarks and began organizing opinion as if it were inventory. On Saturday morning, he cleared the store's front table, set coffee pot and account books where customers could gather, and spoke of social order while weighing sugar for households already in debt. He said public calm was a commodity as dear as flour. That rumor consumed it, and that lines strung across common paths invited panic and accidental injury. By noon, 3 men had repeated his phrasing at the pump, almost word for word. One added that any alarm system not sanctioned by church council was, by definition, private fear. Another asked whether Ford planned to invoice the town for every pull of wire. The mockery had shifted from laughter to doctrine, and doctrine spread faster. Pressure followed speech. Teamsters who had quietly hauled short loads for Shane on cash terms now found reasons to avoid his draw road, citing axle trouble when their wagons stood sound. A carpenter withdrew an order of cut boards promised for Ruth Bellamy's schoolyard drill stand after Kincaid delayed payment on a larger contract. At Sunday service, Reverend Hale did not name Shane, yet he preached from the pulpit against devices of anxious men and urged trust in established authority, and heads turned in the pews until even children understood who sat outside that blessing. The following day, 2 boys tied bell wire from a mule harness along Shane's fence line and shook it at dusk to mimic alarm, then ran laughing when he stepped out with lantern. He removed the false wire, coiled it, and said nothing to their fathers. His silence was not surrender. It was allocation of effort. Ruth Bellamy and her mother received their share of exclusion as the price of standing near him. At the communal wash shed, women who had accepted Ruth's medicine notes in October now finished conversation when she entered. A pie social list posted at the school door omitted the Bellamy name, then reappeared after 2 days with their line penciled in a different hand at the bottom. Ruth continued message duty without complaint. Boots laced tight, pocket watch tied by cord under her shawl. Shane gave her authority that no public committee had granted by asking her to lead 2 dusk drills. While he repaired anchors on the western branch, she did so with a clarity that unsettled older men. She called times aloud in full numbers, demanded repeat runs when children straggled, and reported failures in a notebook copied from Miriam's format. Date, household, route, elapsed minutes, correction required. Practice turned into habit. Habit turned into capability. Capability made mockery less convincing, though not yet less loud. On November the 17th, with morning temperature at 12 degrees and wind flat from the north, Kincaid's opposition hardened into institutional form. He appeared at Shane's draw with Deputy Aaron Pike and a folded paper bearing the mark of 2 council signers. The paper did not ban the line, for there was no ordinance to support that. But it declared that no wire might cross the main street approaches within wagon height and no signal might be tied to church structure without formal consent. Kincaid read it as if delivering sentence, one gloved finger under each line, then looked to Pike for enforcement. Pike, 31 years old and lean from winter patrols, stood with hat brim white at the edge from frost and said only that posted notices would satisfy the requirement if routes were marked before night traffic. Shane answered that the six-house loop crossed no main street and no church timber. He showed measurements in his ledger and invited Pike to verify each span. Pike did so, walking post to post with a measuring tape, then told Kincaid the line stood legal by the town's own language. Kincaid folded the paper with sharp motions and departed without farewell. By noon, 4 new jokes about legal madness were circulating at the store porch, but the attempted stop had failed in plain view. 3 days of signs had already convinced Shane that raid timing would favor darkness before a weather break. He read Land and Stock as other men read newspapers. Dogs did not merely bark. They fixed on 2 ridges in alternating sequence, then went silent together, which suggested movement testing reaction rather than random predator scent. A band of geese crossed lower than season and without the usual arguing call, driving hard southwest before noon. At Carter Creek Crossing, he found horse sign overlaying wagon ruts from the prior day, shod with square toe plates uncommon in local purchases, and one print showed a right foreshoe reset crooked, leaving a clipped crescent on firm ground that could be recognized again. He marked that shape in the ledger margin. At the Hale place, chickens refused yard feed and packed beneath slatted pens despite clear sky. At Bellamy Ridge, the old milk cow bawled twice toward empty ground after sunset and pulled against her tether until rope fibers frayed. None of these signs proved intent on their own. Together, they formed a pattern he treated as evidence. The town chose easier interpretations. Men at the hitch rail said dogs barked because coyotes were hungry, and geese flew low when wind changed, as if common explanation erased uncommon combination. Kincaid told customers that anxious souls gathered omens the way children gathered polished stones, for comfort rather than truth. Reverend Hale visited 2 outlying homes and advised family prayer in place of repeated night drills that disturbed the young. One rancher laughed that clipped horseshoes were found wherever a farrier drank too much coffee. Even those who had quietly asked Shane for lamp placement now spoke cautiously in public, careful not to be seen as joining his camp. Pride in a settlement of 286 souls was a brittle currency, and many preferred to spend caution in private while purchasing confidence in daylight speech. By late afternoon, the weather offered a deceptive gentleness that Shane distrusted more than open storm. Temperature rose from 12 to 24 degrees by 3 o'clock, with almost no wind, and sound carried too clean across the draw, each hammer strike from the far blacksmith reaching his cellar door as if through clear tube. That stillness reminded him of Miriam's note from a Highland page, copied in her hand beside a drawing of 6 linked crofts. The hours before a strike are often tidy. He rode the entire loop on his bay gelding, checking every anchor stone with boot heel and wrench, then ran a full-coated sequence from the clacker, while Ruth timed acknowledgement pulls from each house. Morrow answered at 21 seconds, Bellamy at 19, Hale at 24. The far south branch lagged to 32 on first try, then corrected to 26 after line slack was taken at post 14. He entered each number in ink and underlined the maximum twice. At dusk, he called the 6 household heads to his cellar yard, not as an assembly against town authority, but as a practical briefing for those already connected. Lanterns were hooded, and voices remained low. He laid out final instructions in measured order, lamps trimmed but extinguishable in one breath, water pails filled and set away from door swing, blankets rolled near cellar hatch, boots placed beside sleeping pallets with toes pointed toward exit. and one adult wake every hour until dawn if dogs signaled twice in sequence. He distributed 6 small whistles cut from cane, each tuned to carry farther than a shout in windbreaks, and assigned one to each household lead. No speech ran long. Questions were short and answered shorter. When meeting ended, households dispersed by separate paths to avoid a visible procession that might draw attention from any watcher on ridge. Night settled with low cloud and no moon rise visible from the draw. Around 9 o'clock, Deputy Pike rode through the inner street and paused at Shane's Lane, saying only that he would keep near the schoolhouse corner until first light and that his patrol route would pass within hearing of the Bellamy branch at each circuit. Shane nodded once and handed him the revised pulse card, oilskin wrapped. Pike tucked it into his coat and rode on. An hour later, Owen Lark was seen carrying kindling to the store loft, while Kincaid stood in the doorway looking north, coat unbuttoned despite the cold, as if listening for a sound he had spent 2 weeks pretending not to hear. In the cellar, Shane banked coals under the pitch pot, set the clacker handle within easy reach, and waited beside the tuned cans while the town held its breath without admitting it had done so. He had done so at 2:17 in the morning on November 18th, 1888, with the outside thermometer nailed to Shane's cellar post reading 9 degrees. The morrow gave one violent flat note that did not decay naturally but shuddered in repeated strikes, line vibration traveling the full north branch with a force no drifting branch or loose staple could imitate. Shane was standing when the second strike came. He set one hand on the board to steady the tone and counted the interval as Miriam had taught him. 13 seconds later, the Bellamy branch answered with 2 short pulls and 1 long, the ridge confirmation they had drilled for close movement from a separate approach. Riders from 2 directions. Deliberate timing. The pattern was not rumor anymore. He cranked the clacker at once. 3 rapid pulses. Pause. 3 rapid pulses again to account for sleep and fear, then reached for his coat and rifle without breaking rhythm. The striker wheel bit and released in iron cadence across the network, and from the far branches acknowledgement pulls came back in staggered sequence. 19 seconds, 22, 25, each one telling him a household had heard and moved. He marked nothing in the ledger. There was no ledger hour for this work. By 2:19 he had banked the lantern, hooded it to narrow slits, and mounted from the rail crossline he had installed for that exact transition. He rode the inner lane bent low over the bay gelding's neck, using the hooded light only at turn points, never full beam so the line would guide friendlies without gifting aim to strangers. The first gunfire came from the north draw at 2:21, 3 quick shots into timber siding at the Morrow place, then 2 from the ridge side answering like hammers on opposite walls. Lamps were already out in 5 of 6 linked homes. At the 6th, a South Branch family whose timing had lagged in the last drill, 1 kitchen lamp still burned for several breaths before it vanished. Riders who had expected window glow and silhouettes found dark rectangles and empty bedding. Their next tactic came fast. A bottle flame arced into the Hale yard and struck a haystack edge, taking with a dry roar that climbed higher than the shed roof in less than a minute. The weather had given them fuel. 3 windless hours of deceptive mildness the day before had dried out a straw, and now the cold made every board brittle as bone. Shane reached the Bellamy cut-through at 2:23 and sounded 1 cane whistle blast, the prearranged signal for movement complete. Ruth answered from stone cover with 2 blasts, clear and controlled. Her mother stood with a wet blanket over the hatch lip, as instructed, while 2 neighboring women passed water pails hand to hand from a barrel they had filled before sleeping. The drill had converted panic into sequence. There was no shouting in that yard, only direct words and measured motion. Shane pointed to the ridgeline and said, "No lamps. No return fire without sightline." Hold your cover and count every report. He rode on before anyone could ask him to stay. Across town, plans that had existed only as confidence failed in minutes. 2 households beyond the 6-house loop had no coded line, only door bolts and prayer. One family ran to the church and found the bell rope cut at shoulder height, exactly as Griever had warned from South Pass. At the store, Owen Lark fired from the loft window at muzzle flashes near the hitch rail, then jammed his lever in the cold because he had not warmed the action under his coat between rounds. Kincaid, who had relied on one armed clerk and no outer watch, woke to smoke already in the stockroom where sacks of flour and sugar took ember from shattered lantern glass. He shouted for bucket lines that did not form because the nearest men were guarding their own roofs. His polished authority did not carry farther than his own porch. By 2:28, the first wave of riders shifted from probing fire to ignition, targeting outbuildings, wagon canvas, and stacked feed where flame could force movement into open ground. Shane cut through Hale Draw and saw Thomas Hale, 62 years old and broad as an old cottonwood, trying to free a team wagon whose tongue had caught fire at the trace pin. Hale had pulled his coat over his mouth and was working the chain with both mittens while sparks lifted around his shoulders. Shane shouted for him to leave it and take cover. Hale did not move. The wagon held winter oats for 2 households, and he would not abandon it. A shot cracked from the dark beyond the fence line. Hale jerked once, took 2 backward steps as if surprised by uneven ground, and sat hard against the wheel he had tried to save. Shane reached him with one hand under the arm, but Hale's breath had already shortened to shallow pulls that clouded and thinned in the cold. "Cut it loose," Hale said, voice rough but steady. "Do not lose the feed." He died before the chain was clear, one mitten still hooked through the iron link. 20 minutes after the first pulse, the network had prevented confusion but not loss. Firelight pushed low orange against cloud, and gun reports echoed from draws in broken intervals as raiders tested for movement. At the Morrow place, Eliza Morrow had already taken her younger brothers below grade and thrown blankets over the hatch, then gone back for the rolled winter quilts stored by the stove because she knew what a hard freeze would do to old bones without insulation. She came out once, face gray with smoke, carrying 2 rolls and dropping them at the hatch. She turned back despite shouted warnings from both sides of the yard. When she emerged the second time, she stumbled at the threshold, one hand on the door jamb, and could not draw full breath. Shane and Ruth's mother reached her together, dragged her clear and laid her on packed snow while someone fanned cool air with a hat brim. Her eyes remained open, fixed on the hatch she had protected. She did not speak again. She was 29 years old. The assault tightened around the school lane near 236, where Deputy Aaron Pike had kept his patrol as promised. He used the schoolhouse corner as hard cover, firing only at confirmed movement and calling short commands toward the shelter line. 7 boarders from the school annex and 2 teachers moved from rear door to stone wall in the intervals he created. When the last of them reached cover, Pike stayed on the corner to block a flank approach from the alley between Cooper Shed and Chapel Fence. A round struck him high in the side. He did not fall at once. He braced, fired once more, then slid to one knee and kept his hat low over the rifle sight until Shane and 2 ranch hands could pull him back by the coat collar. Snow packed under him and darkened quickly, then stiffened as the cold took hold. Pike remained conscious long enough to ask whether the annex had cleared. When told it had, he closed his eyes and nodded once. He died before first light, 31 years old, pulse weakening under a blanket that could not hold enough heat against blood loss in November cold. By 2:40, the raiders had learned that the 6 linked homes were not yielding easy targets. Windows were dark, movement disciplined, and return fire selective. They turned their weight toward the inner street where uncoordinated response remained, and there Kincaid paid the price of public mockery turned private hesitation. His rear shed was already gone. The porch rail had collapsed in one corner. The store roof caught along the tar seam and began dropping embers into the dry goods aisle. Owen Lark shouted from the loft that powder tins had to be moved. Kincaid tried to form a bucket line from the trough and found only 2 men willing to stand exposed without coordinated cover. One was hit in the shoulder and crawled behind a water barrel. The other ran for his own barn when flames jumped the alley. Kincaid stood in ash and shouted names that did not answer. Then he looked toward the draw where Shane's redundant loop ran low through the creek bed, barely visible except where frost made a dull silver edge along the wire. He had called it lunacy. He had sold ridicule by the spool. Now he dropped to his knees beside that wire and pulled the distress code with both hands. 3 hard jerks. Pause. 3 again. The signal he had heard in practice and pretended not to notice. In Shane's cellar, the can tone for the inner branch rang harsh and continuous. Ruth, stationed there by prior order to relay if he was riding the loop, counted the pattern and called it out when he returned at 2:43. Central Street distress, repeated, from Kincaid Branch. Her voice did not shake. Shane took one breath, checked the clacker spring, and sent a new sequence over all branches. Muster teams with wet blankets, axes, and 2 armed covermen each. He did not ask who had mocked him. He assigned work. The response came in pieces, then in force. Bellamy sent 2 men with shovel and hook pole. Hale Draw, despite Thomas Hale's death not 15 minutes old, sent his eldest son with a water sled and 3 pails. Morrow sent 1 woman and 1 older boy carrying soaked quilts and a pry bar. Shane placed each arrival by function, not by household rank. Cover fire from stone corners. Bucket relay from trough to store rear. Entry team through side door below smoke line. At 2:51, they breached the stockroom and rolled powder tins out under canvas, then hauled ledger books and medicine crates to the churchyard, where sparks could not reach. Owen Lark came down from the loft coughing hard, but upright. Kincaid tried to lift a flour sack alone and failed. Shane and Bellamy took 1 side each and dragged it clear without remark. The raid broke after 3:04, not because attackers had emptied their anger, but because the town had stopped presenting isolated, illuminated targets and begun acting as a linked defense with shared signals and timed movement. Hoofbeats thinned northward and westward in separate lines. At first gray, trackers found clipped crescent sign near Carter Creek, exactly matching the shoeprint Shane had marked in Miriam's ledger margin. The reconnaissance that cut his wire on the 14th had returned with friends. The town had survived because the line had returned as well. By sunrise, the temperature had dropped to 6 degrees. Smoke lay close over both streets, and frost had formed on blackened boards, where water thrown in the night had frozen in sheets. 3 named dead were carried to the church annex under blankets that did not hide the shape of loss. Thomas Hale from the wagon trace, Eliza Morrow from her own doorway, Aaron Pike from the schoolhouse corner he had held until others cleared. No bell rang that morning. The rope had been cut cleanly, hanging in 2 frayed lengths above the entry. Kincaid stood near the store ruins with ash on his broadcloth coat and blistered hands wrapped in torn linen. His boots were no longer polished. He watched Shane direct salvage piles by category: grain, medicine, tools, lamp oil, and did not interrupt until the immediate fire risk was contained and wounded were under roofs. Then, in the open street where men who had laughed could hear him, he said, "I pulled your line because I had no other warning left. Tell me what is required and I will do it." Shane set down the hook pole, looked once toward the church annex where the dead had been laid, and answered in a tone as level as his measurements. "What is required is work. Bring every serviceable coil from your back room. Open your ledger to public count. We run signals to every house before tonight. What is required is work. Bring every serviceable coil from your back room. Open your ledger to public count. We run signals to every house before tonight. Kincaid did not argue. He turned, called for Owen Lark, and together they dragged out 2 kegs of mixed wire, 1 crate of staples, 3 partial tins of pitch, and a narrow lockbox of ferrules he had held for spring fencing contracts. Shane had the lockbox opened in front of 6 witnesses and read each line item while Ruth Bellamy wrote a parallel count on school slates so no household could claim hidden stock after daylight. Grain sacks were stacked along the church wall. Medicine crates moved into the annex, and salvage teams were assigned by strength, not by surname. The dead remained under blankets until the living had roofs that would hold another night. By noon on November 18th, Coldwater's 2 streets looked less like a town and more like a work camp under orders. Men who had mocked tension gauges now held posts while Shane checked lean with a transit level. Women who had not crossed Shane's threshold in weeks carried hot water to his cellar and learned to seal splices with thin pitch instead of thick globs that cracked in cold. Ruth stood at the clackerboard and called cadence for test pulls, her pocket watch open in her palm, voice clear enough to carry over hammer blows. Every completed branch was tagged with a scrap of flour sack, marked in lamp black. Tested, heard, confirmed. Shane opened Miriam's cedar chest and set its notebooks on the cellar table for all to see, not as heirlooms but as manuals. He read instructions aloud in plain terms, then made each listener repeat the sequence and perform it once with gloved hands. $1 pulleys were replaced by cottonwood rollers when supplies ran short. Broken harness rings became guide eyes. A bent stoveplate became a striker for a blind corner pin. Cheap things held because they had been set with care. Expensive things failed because they had been trusted without drills. The contrast shamed many who watched. Kincaid's polished counter had burned to a black ribcage. The brass register he had imported from Cheyenne sat warped in ash. Yet Shane's 10x14 cellar, roofed with split poles and clay that had cost less than 1 broadcloth coat, had stayed dry, warm enough for instrument work and steady under strain. The line he built from salvage at 5 6 cents a pound had outperformed rifles left unloaded, bell ropes left unguarded, and confidence purchased on credit. Near dusk, Shane sent teams outward with fixed tasks. 1 crew to extend line to the 2 unlinked homes by Carter Creek, 1 to raise a spare bell rope in the church tower with a guard post at the stair, 1 to copy pull codes on boards for every doorway in town. He gave no speech. He gave measurements. Post depth 3 feet. Anchor stone no less than 25 pounds. Acknowledgement pull within 30 seconds or repeat until heard. Fear scattered men in the night. Procedure gathered them again. After dark, when the final test tone came back from all branches, he walked to the annex where Thomas Hale, Eliza Morrow, and Aaron Pike lay in pine boxes made that afternoon from salvaged boards. He removed his hat and stood in silence while Reverend Hale read from Scripture in a voice roughened by smoke. Kincaid stood 2 rows back with bandaged hands and did not lift his eyes. 3 days passed before the first private apology came. It was not Kincaid. It was Jonas Carter, who had laughed at spoon bells in October and now arrived at dawn with 2 straight cedar posts on his shoulder. He set them by Shane's door and said, "I called your work fear. My son crossed a stone by that same work. I was wrong in full measure." Shane nodded once, took the posts, and asked whether Carter could return at first light to learn ferrule seating. Carter came back with his son. The next evening, Mrs. Hale brought the old church bell rope, both frayed halves tied together for carrying. She asked Shane to inspect the cut. He held the fibers under lantern and showed 3 close shears, clean and practiced, then one ragged tear where haste had finished what steel began. "One hand cut it," he said, "and one hand cut my west branch on the 14th. Same tool width, same bite." Mrs. Hale asked whether he would name a suspect. He said evidence could point without accusing where proof was absent, and that Coldwater would post watch pairs at every public line until snowfall erased tracks for good. The clipped crescent shoe print was copied on paper and sent with Pike's death report to the territorial marshal at South Pass. The answer returned 12 days later. Riders likely tied to 2 recent stock raids farther west. Names uncertain. Pursuit suspended by weather. The town could not rely on distant justice before winter closed. By the first week of December, reckoning moved from doorsteps into the open. Reverend Hale asked for a town gathering in the church, not for celebration but for accounting. Attendance was entered by household in the ledger. 271 souls present, 15 absent to illness, 1 widow too weak to travel from the ridge. Lamps were trimmed low. The patched bell rope hung above them, plain as a scar. Kincaid rose first. His broadcloth was gone, replaced by plain wool with ash stains that had not fully washed out. He held the old chalkboard from his store, the one that had read "Madness sold here" by the spool. He set it against the front pew where all could read the faint remaining letters. Then he spoke for a long minute without movement, voice steady but stripped of porch confidence. I named this line to diminish it. I repeated that name until others repeated it for me. On the night of the raid, I had 1 clerk, no outer watch and no second plan. When fire reached my stockroom, I went to the wire I had called lunacy and pulled for help with both hands. Men whose dead lay in this annex answered that pull and saved my storebooks, medicine crates, and my clerk's life. I was wrong in word, wrong in judgment, and wrong in influence. I do not ask to erase that record. I ask to work under public rules that prevent one merchant from deciding who receives warning, food, or tools in a crisis. After him came others, not in tidy order, but in the rough sequence of conscience. A ranch hand admitted he had told boys to mock bell sounds. A council signer admitted he had used delay as refusal, without saying the word no. Reverend Hale admitted his sermon against anxious devices had burdened families who needed drills more than admonition. Owen Lark admitted he had hidden spare wire by Kincaid's order in early November, and then retrieved it during the fire by Shane's command. He placed that coil at Shane's feet in front of the congregation. When the speaking turned toward Shane, he didn't step forward at once. He remained near the side aisle until silence settled, then moved to the front with Miriam's 4th notebook in his hand, its corners darkened by years of use. He laid it on the pulpit but kept one palm over the page where her repeated line stood. My wife, Miriam, learned this craft from her mother's people in the Highland sheep stations, and she taught it to me with correction, not with praise. In that chain, there is no place for ownership of warning. If one house keeps warning private, all houses become late. If one store sets price by fear, hunger arrives before weather does. I heard what was said about this line. I remember every word. Those words did harm, but I did not build for vindication, and I will not manage this town by grievance. He paused, looked toward the annex door where the 3 coffins had stood days earlier, and continued in the same measured tone. Thomas Hale is dead because he chose feed for neighbors over his own cover. Eliza Morrow is dead because she made one return too many for winter blankets. Aaron Pike is dead because he held a corner until children crossed a stone. Do not ask me for quick forgiveness while those names are fresh under frozen ground. Ask me for instruction and I will give it. Ask me for a system where duty is shared and records are open, and I will help build it. Whether you call that forgiveness is for your own keeping. No one applauded. Coldwater was not that kind of town. Instead, households lined by task. The Bellamys took monthly drill records. Reverend Hale took bell watch scheduling. Kincaid surrendered emergency inventory keys to a 3-family council before walking out of the church. He handed one key to Ruth Bellamy's mother in full view of the room. By March 1889, after a winter of hard crust mornings and nights that froze water pails to barn floors, the network had grown from 6 linked homes to a full ring of 37 houses plus church and school. Each branch tested on the first Monday of every month at sundown. Codes were painted on pine boards and renewed when weather faded them. Response times were posted publicly. Prices for emergency goods were set by weight and signed by all 3 council holders, with ledger copies in church and store, so no single hand could gouge under smoke. On October the 17th, 1893, 5 years to the day after Shane first paced Coldwater's streets, the town count stood at 341 souls. 2 new outlying farms were added to the ring using younger men trained from Miriam's notebooks. Ruth Bellamy, now a school assistant, taught children to identify tones by ear and to run ditch routes in boots and coats under timed drills. They learned names as well as codes. Thomas Hale, Eliza Morrow, Aaron Pike. Their deaths were not recited as warning theater, but as civic instruction in cost. Years later, when telegraph service reached nearer settlements and better road patrols reduced mounted raids, the Ford line remained, adjusted, repaired, and simplified, but never abandoned. Storm alerts, fire calls, and flood warnings traveled its branches. The old derisive phrase dropped away. No one said Madness Line except visiting traders who had not been there in 1888, and they were corrected before supper. The cellar in the draw still stands. Its rafters hold the first 6 resonance cans, dented and dark with age, each marked by Ruth's hand in neat script after she became record keeper. North Flat, Ridge High, Hale Low, Bellamy East, Morrow Draw, Central Confirm. Miriam's notebook rests in a locked church chest each winter, brought out each spring for apprentice lessons. Children copy 1 sentence onto slate at the start of every training season, then carry it home to nail by their doors. Warning that arrives late is not warning. On the 8th of April, 1889, the first Monday drill after thaw, 37 household leads stood in Shane Ford's draw with slates under their arms, while children copied Miriam's sentence by lantern light and nailed the boards beside their own doors before full dark. Shane had arranged 6 stations in a ring around the cellar: splice bench, anchor pit, code table, clacker post, fire bucket line, and shelter entry. Nothing at any station was costly. Cottonwood rollers turned on axle pins cut from broken harness buckles. Guide eyes were forged from stove hinge scraps. A barrel hoop became a tension gauge. Kincaid's warped brass register, salvaged from his burned counter, now held only drill weights, each stamped in ounces so the emergency council could issue staples, lamp oil, and flour by measure, and not by favor. That same evening, he opened the church chest in front of Reverend Hale, Ruth Bellamy, Mrs. Bellamy, and Kincaid, and accounted for every item that had passed through his hands since the raid. The ferrule lockbox from Kincaid's back room held 11 pieces remaining, all counted and entered into both ledgers. The 2 kegs of mixed wire stood reduced to 1/2 keg, the rest already set in branch lines to Carter Creek and the Chapel Lane. The old cut bell rope, tied in 2 frayed lengths, was wrapped in oilcloth and labeled for instruction, because Shane wanted every apprentice to see what deliberate sabotage looked like in braided hemp. The clipped crescent shoeprint sketch and the territorial martial reply were placed flat between ledger pages, outcome written beside them in Ruth's hand. Riders not identified. Pursuit suspended by snow. Local watch continued by necessity. 3 days later, on April 11th, a widow from the South Edge, Martha Keene, arrived with a bent shovel and a sack of spoiled meal and said she had no coin for springseed. Kincaid was present at the code table, reading acknowledgement times aloud for younger boys, and heard the request before Shane answered. Shane took the meal sack, tested the grain by smell, and shook his head. "This cannot be fed," he said. "Not to child, not to stock." He directed Ruth to issue 2 pounds of sound cornmeal from the communal store and mark it against the weather loss column, then handed Martha a serviceable shovel from the repair pile. Kincaid stepped forward, removed his own penknife from his vest, and scraped the old chalkboard clean to write the exchange in public view. 1 shovel issued, 2 pounds meal. No debt attached. Labor credit offered at drill yard. He did it without prompting. The town watched the subtraction of pride become procedure. By January 9th, 1890, the ring system faced its second proving, not from riders but from weather that struck with equal indifference. A blizzard came down from the northwest before dawn, temperature falling to 14 below by noon, wind hard enough to flatten smoke against roofs and erase lane edges in less than an hour. At 1:12 in the afternoon, the Bellamy branch sent 1 long and 1 short, not raiders but structural distress, barn roof lift at the ridgeline. Shane sent central pulses for tether teams and shelter transfer. At 1:20, the Keene line answered with 2 short and 1 long, stove flue blocked, children coughing. He redirected crews by code while snow drove sideways through every gap in wool and leather. No one debated authority. Kincaid and Owen Lark hauled coal scuttles from store cellar to annex shelter under wet blankets, then returned for medicine crates in the same sequence they had learned during fire drills. Reverend Hale kept a door roster by soul count. Ruth timed every branch acknowledgement with her watch and called misses for immediate repeat. The walls held. The system held. No household was left uncounted by nightfall. After that storm, reckoning continued not as one speech, but as a year of doorstep conversations that could not be performed for applause. On March 3rd, 1890, Jonas Carter brought his 2 boys to Shane's splice bench and repeated in front of them the line he had once used in mockery, then explained why it had been cowardice dressed as wit. On May 17th, Owen Lark admitted that on November the 13th, before the raid, he had seen a stranger horse tied near Kincaid pasture at dusk and had said nothing because he feared being called fearful. He described the clipped right foreshoe and the rider's nippers hanging from saddle ring. He had not cut the line, and no proof ever placed Cutter's hand among cold water households, yet he had withheld warning by silence. Shane entered Owen's statement in the incident ledger, then put him in charge of blind approach trip pins for summer patrol season. "Speech is less useful than assignment," he told him. "Do the assignment." Kincaid's own fullest confession came on November 18th, 1891 at the 3rd memorial service, after names had been read, and after Thomas Hale's son had rung the repaired church bell with the new guarded rope. Kincaid stood where he had once displayed cloth bolts and said, with both hands visible at his sides, "I mistook control for stewardship. I used credit to command, and I used ridicule to keep command. When the raid came, command burned faster than dry pine." Stewardship was what this town practiced in the draw with salvage wire, measured flour, and watch pairs. He then produced a small wrapped parcel and handed it to Shane in front of the congregation. It was Miriam's silver hair comb, bought back at cost from the same traveling jeweler who had purchased it in November 1888. Kincaid said he had looked at it for 2 years and understood what its sale had financed. Shane did not thank him with ceremony. He unwrapped the comb, checked its teeth for damage as if inspecting a tool, and placed it in the church chest beside the notebooks, where private sacrifice became public memory. On June 2nd, 1893, the council finalized the document that removed emergency goods from sole merchant control and fixed permanent rules for allocation during fire, raid, flood, or winter closure. Shane insisted the rules include one severe clause. Any household that failed to attend 2 consecutive monthly drills lost voting voice on code changes until attendance resumed. Some thought it harsh. He answered in open meeting, "Sentiment does not move a child to stone cover in 7 minutes. Practice does." Ruth, now 19 and already teaching younger children tone recognition, seconded the clause and added a school requirement that every child over 10 perform one-night drill each quarter in full boots and coat. The motion passed by counted hands, 29-6. No one ever proved who cut the west segment on November 14th, 1888. The nipper marks remained a lesson rather than a solved crime, and the clipped crescent sign stayed in the ledger margin as a reminder that prevention could not wait for certainty. The territorial marshal sent one final note in August 1894, stating that 2 suspected stock raiders had died in a canyon crossing west of South Pass and that identification records were incomplete. Coldwater entered the note, closed the external file, and kept posting watch pairs anyway. Some truths arrived late. The line had taught them to act before that. When Shane turned 50 in the autumn of 1900, he transferred daily maintenance authority to a 3-part structure that would outlast him. Ruth Bellamy as record keeper and training lead, Thomas Hale's son Elias as field foreman for posts and anchors, and Owen Lark as quartermaster for repair stock. He retained one role only: apprentice instruction from Miriam's notebooks each spring and first frost. At the opening lesson that year, he placed the old chalkboard at the front of the cellar yard. The faint ghost of madness sold here by the spool still showed under the grain. He wrote over it in clean block letters, "Warning belongs to every household." Then he handed the chalk to a 12-year-old girl from Carter Creek and told her to call the first code herself. By 1910, Coldwater counted 402 souls, and every new house raised within 6 miles received a line bracket before its front door trim. The school kept 2 maps on opposite walls, one for arithmetic districts and one for alarm branches, because in that settlement both were considered literacy. The annex held 3 framed cards with names in black ink: Thomas Hale, Eliza Morrow, Aaron Pike, and below each name one sentence describing what duty had cost and why it mattered. Kincaid, gray and slower but still present at inventory nights, read those sentences aloud each November without omission. He never asked Shane for personal absolution again. In the winter of 1916, after a minor stroke left his right hand stiff, Shane came to the cellar less often and sat more while others worked. On one clear afternoon, Ruth brought him the church chest inventory for signature, every line balanced, notebooks dry and intact, comb wrapped and unchanged, cut rope preserved, incident ledger complete through current year, remaining first-generation resonance cans retired from active use and hung above the school door as instruction pieces. He signed with deliberate pressure and said, "That is enough." He died the following spring, not in violence, not in debt, but in his own room with the window open to thaw wind and the town's watch bell sounding first Monday drill. Coldwater buried him beside Miriam on a rise above the draw, and the procession included households whose grandparents had once mocked his posts from porch rails. They carried no grand monument. They carried tools. After the service, Ruth reopened the schoolyard station and ran the scheduled drill at sundown because the ledger date required it. Children moved to cover in 6 minutes, 49 seconds on the first run. She recorded the time, corrected 2 route errors, and posted next month's assignments before extinguishing the lantern. The line remained taut across dark ground, modest in cost, exact in purpose, and held by hands that had learned at last that generosity was strongest when it was organized.